Hello, everyone, in person and in Zoom. I'm Ziv. I'm a postdoc here. I have some feedback.
Maybe I turn my microphone on.
Does that help?
I'm muted.
Okay, great.
Oh, you're on microphone.
I think we're good. Cool. So I'm a postdoc here, and it is my honor to introduce Joel Simon, who's sitting here, visiting from California to give a talk. Joel is a multidisciplinary artist, toolmaker, and practicing researcher based in Berkeley, exploring new metaphors for interacting with technology. He is the founder and director of Morphogen and the creator of Artbreeder, a massively collaborative machine learning artist interface. His work spans artificial life simulations, generative architecture, creative social networks, and tools for fighting gerrymandering. Previously, he conducted bioinformatics research at Rockefeller University and studied computer science and art at Carnegie Mellon. He is currently part of Stochastic Labs, and his work has been featured at venues including Ars Electronica, NeurIPS, and Science Friday. I think that's some very interesting things to talk to us today at the intersection of creativity and human flourishing. So join me in welcoming Joel. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for the intro. I guess I'll use the microphone on this one. Does that work well? Cool. Okay, yes, it's great to be here today. Thanks so much for coming on Halloween. This talk is about computation and imagination. I'll share how this connects to work I do as an artist, researcher, and toolmaker, working between sculpture, machine learning, and virtual life. This matters to me because I think the joy and meaning of creativity comes from our ability to both express and surprise ourselves. Computation can serve as a lens to understand this process and a medium to extend it. I've come to see creating new tools and mediums, not just as a means to an end, but like adding new limbs and language, extensions of our creative capacities and ways of thinking. To learn woodworking is to learn to think like a woodworker and gain a new vocabulary of ideas. This feels more important than ever in a world increasingly focused on automating and cheapening creativity, what we call slop. I'll argue the slop comes from misunderstandings of imagination and creativity. I'm someone inspired by the emergent systems, complex systems, and processes in biology and creativity. What makes the orchestration of a cell possible? Why was Florence during the Renaissance so creative?
Maybe do you want to just move the window so we can see
the
full? I think it's on yours.
That's on mine.
Slide that away.
You press the sort bar to minimize it entirely.
I didn't even notice that. There we go. Okay, great, thank you. For the last 5 years, I've run Morphogen, a studio I created focused on speculative and playful AI tools. Morphogens being the decentralized signals that help give rise to biological form. I helped Stochastic Labs for the Art Science Technology Residency Program, and recently began a role researching open-ended creative systems. I originated this journey by considering how to consolidate my practice in sculpture and computer science in a way that didn't give up the actual hands-on fun of sculpting and explore the questions of creating computationally and not just digitally. I started writing code to augment my own sculptures in ways I could not. Unleashing deformation and decay via simulation. That led to speculative generative architecture process inspired by emergent genotype to phenotype mappings used in virtual life and genetic algorithms. Evolving virtual floor plans, here's a school in Maine that I took, and I optimized it. In this case, kind of ant colony and other growth algorithms. To overcome exponential complexity, this custom growth process was devised, where ant colony and other algorithms are run and have their meta parameters optimized. In essence, to create something, you must first grow it. However, it also revealed some of the fragility and absurdity. Asking for windows only got interior ones. While somewhat absurd, the virality of this project led to working directly with several architects and some online controversy. Continuing research in morphological emergence, evolving corals with an optimization engine based on neural cellular automata, evolved genetic algorithms, and here are functioning morphogens. All the colors here on the surface are actually learned by the system. Okay, cool. I was curious to explore the capacity to sculpt with objectives as a kind of metaphorical interface. Here, using corals grown in different environments of light and depth, which would affect their final phenotypes. And so if I can grow a form by controlling its environment, what would it mean to grow a cup or a couch that could grow optimized for its environment? This kind of morphogenic design has been the motivating thesis for my work basically the last almost 10 years now. Chris Langdon famously defined artificial life as the study of life as it could be, of possible life, in contrast to biology's study of life as we know it to be. In bridging virtual life and computational creativity, I'm interested in imagination as it could be, speculative, provocative design, like the floor plan, that yields decision-making to algorithms like optimization algorithms, which can, via their kind of ignorance and novel ways of thinking, puncture the soft membrane of cultural norms and assumptions. AlphaGo's Move 37 ushered in a flourishing of new Go playstyles. As a computational architect told me, I would never have done that generative floor plan project if I had gone to computational architecture grad school. I would have known why it was so wrong. And so in a way, by not having an education and by deferring something to the algorithm, it'll unlock new possibilities for design. In that case, I was particularly interested in the affordance of the 3D printed buildings. So continuing on with,
Hold on.
oh, yeah.
Your screen is not sharing all of your slides. We
Oh.
only see like a portion of them. Could you try redoing it?
Yeah, I can definitely try doing it. Okay, let me try sharing the whole screen then. Let me turn this on. Is that better?
I think so. Try going through. Yeah, okay. I think that's better.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for catching that.
Yep.
Okay, so in the spirit of morphogenic design, I like to kind of think about creating things that we couldn't have imagined or conceived of on our own. And so I like to kind of ask the question or provocation, what is the most sophisticated or complicated object or thing we've ever designed? You get a lot of answers to this question. Maybe it's a nuclear power plant. Maybe it's the International Space Station. Maybe it's one of those like ASML chip machines, all of which are obviously extremely complicated devices that humanity's managed to create. My kind of provocative answer to this question is I don't think it's any of these. I think it's actually dogs. This is Cody and Miles here, family boys. They're very good boys. And so why dogs? Like, did we really design them? And I would argue we did. We kind of transformed wolves into dogs in a very active design process. And in terms of scale, there's tens of trillions of cells that compose a dog. And not only did we create this extremely sophisticated, I wouldn't call it object, obviously, but we designed it. We did it in this kind of radical design process that I think has been really inspiring to me. Not only did we do it, but it was so simple. We really didn't even know we were doing it. And we did it in a kind of decentralized way where whole groups of people were all able to do it. So it was radically simple. It was decentralized. It was locally adaptive. It was multi-purpose. Different regions have dogs bred for different purposes, multiple purposes, hunting, companionship, sheep herding. There's a million things dogs serve in our lives. And we did know that you didn't need a PhD, in dog design to do it. It just happened kind of organically. And we don't really understand the full sophistication of a dog, but it was still in a way a material, the wolf that we transformed. And I think the design process, that's very inspiring. Got me thinking, could you breed floor plans or other objects the way we bred dogs? And that brings me to Artbreeder, a collaborative latent space social network I created in 2018, which was named after the work of PickBreeder, by researchers like Kenneth Stanley and others exploring open and interactive genetic algorithms. And so originally called GANBreeder and later Artbreeder, named after the work of PickBreeder. GANBreeder basically took this recent technology at the time called GANs, which allowed people to generate basically one of the earliest image generation models released by Google back in 2018. And it kind of wrapped creating images with GANs, which at the time was a very kind of technical and arcane process. You had to learn to code, you gave it random numbers, you got an image out, and it kind of wrapped it in this metaphor and this interface of breeding. So you could take an image, you could add, add noise or create variations of it and get children. You could mix two images together and get a child, kind of like breeding. And you also tweak sliders of the conditional class vector, if you're familiar. We're kind of like editing genes. You had kind of, asexual, sexual, CRISPR kind of being the metaphors. And you also had parallels to phases of kind of exploratory search processes, from kind of most open and exploratory to most specific, kind of tweaking defined sliders. And on the left, they're kind of like what the model, like the paper showed you, where it had these different classes of images. You can make a really good hamburger or mushroom. But what this collaborative exploration of the latent space together revealed was this vast richness hiding. The images on the right were the trending page. So users could share their images. People could fork other people's images. They could breed each other. So everything was inherently social and collaborative. And all the technical terminology was kind of was hidden. But in doing so, it actually unlocked a lot more possibilities for creation, because suddenly people were exploring this huge space in this kind of crowdsourced way. And you would see the whole lineage. This is the later version interface inside the platforms. The interface is built around this kind of family tree like interface of remixing and sharing all in one loop. And later on, here's a project from last year where actually I took some of these phylogenies of these Artbreeder images. These prints were shown at Art Basel this year. And so for individual GAN images, what if you actually took every image that went through its whole history and tried to visualize them, and in a way kind of view this collective superorganism of the space. And again, Artbreeder was all public domain. It very much was a philosophy of collective creation, collective ownership. I never touched anything like NFTs with the images, but I think it was a collective kind of project of searching this latent space together and using metaphor to unlock kind of this latent potential. Yeah, no pun intended. You could also kind of like create your own directions in latent space just by uploading images, and you could share those called genes with other people. So in a way, we're all kind of mapping out, we're all cartographers of the latent space, and then sharing our discoveries with other people to be stepping stones for others. And that led to like a huge library of like these user discovered directions in latent space that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And yeah, I mean, back in 2020, this was kind of like state of the art for image generation. The whole community of people were making stuff and posting it, kind of the first wave. Or I would say the second wave of Deep Dream was the first of kind of the public getting their hands on AI image stuff. And so a lot of questions of authorship and ownership that it kind of went through an early peak in 2020, 2021 through Artbreeder, and then later kind of resurged much larger with later technology that brought it even further to the mainstream. I think what I'm most proud of is the artists who actually like got their start on Artbreeder, 3 of who are now gone on to further careers and have become established, and they use the platform as a way to start and begin their journey. And so as a tool maker, I think it's actually really nice when people kind of graduate beyond your tool. I don't see it as a failure if they move on to other tools. The fact that they and others started there, kind of began their AI image journey and continued, is I think one of the coolest parts of it for me as a tool maker. Almost like the joy of like a teacher seeing what your students do and then go on to do later. I think it's also interesting to reflect on it, kind of the as it's gone mainstream, that the tension of being kind of a speculative critical tool maker, then with going mainstream success. So the images on the left are the ones I think are really compelling and novel and feel like things I couldn't have imagined. But with its kind of like TikTok virality in 2020, there's kind of inherent tension with mainstream adaptation and success, where like a lot of users are very interested in, turning their fan fiction or turning like characters from real life, recreating characters from real life. And a little bit further away from these kind of like novel aesthetics that kind of the unimaginable. And so as the domain and generative AI broadly kind of went mainstream, face making, selfie editing became very commercially successful. I decided to keep the studio focused on what I thought were the important principles of craft, exploration, and community. And so kind of these inherent reasons we create things in the first place. On the right is kind of the villagers doing shiny shadow puppetry in the off season. And so one of the first projects the studio did back in 2021, we were trying to, I was really interested in this question, why is it that AI images feel dated like a year after they're done? It's kind of like aura of technological newness is worn off. I think we've seen this each wave. You know, Deep Dream happened, VQGAN happened, GANs happened. Each time they're trying to like breath this hype and excitement, and then 6 months later, you know, it's yesterday's toy, and we've all moved on to the next thing to get excited about. Whereas, in my opinion, there's some kind of timeless beauty that's lasted for thousands of years. These are Cambodian shadow puppets, but most cultures have some history of puppetry. You know, why is it that this technology, a piece of leather on a stick, has beauty 2,000 years later, where the AI stuff, you know, barely makes it 6 months? You know, so I was interested in the question, could AI content ever feel lovingly homemade? Could it have the hand of the creator inside of it? And so the answer to this, of course, was to develop an experimental browser-based collaborative puppet theater based on principles in craft and play. It's using puppetry as a metaphor. Users could build these kind of paper craft puppets and cut them up. And here I am performing a video. I've cut out these pieces. I've rigged them with kind of pins and springs, and I've done with video. Now I can layer them to kind of create this very simple, but I think expressive animations. It also has real-time collaboration built in, focused on the childlike and collective fun of improvising a story rather than focusing on the quality of the output. So emphasis on the process of creating rather than the output. And in this case, we thought a lot about the craft and performance space being one. You know, when you're playing Legos with your friends and you're like, you know, now it's a truck, now it's a plane, and you're tweaking and playing kind of in one loop together and keeping that very fluid and improvisational and expressive. I think about these creative tools as spaces to have kind of creative play with your friends. It was also very focused on, in this case, I'm puppeting a diffusion based video. If you're familiar with IP adapter, oops, here's another one using a later runway video. Well, this one I'll go back to quick. If you're familiar with IP adapter, I'm actually controlling these colored masks on the left mapped to different IP adapter masks that I'm then able to kind of perform in real time. And what I think is important here is like the subtlety of what can't be captured with language. So like subtle motion, the fish jumping out of the water. These are things that you know, you couldn't ever prompt. And so I'm able to have this unpromptable space of subtle motion that you could capture really easily with your hand. You know, how this UFO or the fish moves, and hoping to feel a little myself inside of the video. Unfortunately, puppets was not the future of generative AI. I thought it would be, but it's not too late. It still could be. Maybe another time. So on those kind of three themes I mentioned, the studio has still done a lot of work on exploration-based tools. A lot of the tools fall into one of those kind of three categories. Within exploration, yeah, that's not right, pardon me. There we go. We built Splicer 2, which is kind of tree-based interface for kind of flow-like exploration of the latent space. So you're kind of growing this large tree in place. This is using newer diffusion models where you can actually find ways to kind of mix meaningfully and also have text control. So bringing some of those GAN-like sliders here to diffusion models. So kind of surfing different latent spaces within these models. Here it's like IP adapter space and text embedding space. And trying to, I still think within mixing and blending, you can kind of, you're still limited to the diffusion model, but you're kind of in the space between words, and able to have kind of this open-ended exploration process, which is still very useful, I think, for inspiration. You can apply the same interface to code synthesis. So on the left is like these 3D signed distance field functions. I was breeding these chair objects for each one. There's a parametric function, because it's the code synthesis generates the program for a chair. So you can breed the whole chair program and then tweak all the sliders for it, which is also a good way to get added distribution through code synthesis, doing these SDFs. It would essentially crash the browser if you got too crazy with it, but it was fun to try, kind of crazy SDF. And on the right is you know, breeding whole shaders in the same tool. So this idea of like, as technology becomes increasingly complicated, it's kind of approximating nature, where these shaders are not things I could conceive, but I know kind of like to breed them. And with exploration, another tool I want to mention, a project from 2020 was Antimander. Antimander applied multi-objective optimization to actually congressional districts. And by exploring the space of kind of proto-optimal districts, it would allow the public kind of build intuitions around this kind of multi-objective optimization landscape, right? So if you're talking about congressional districting, you know, do you want compactness or do you want symmetrical fairness? And there are all these different metrics at play. And so actually the algorithm here is a useful tool in kind of illuminating that landscape and then showing the public, well, why is this bad? And you can do a kind of comparative analysis. And by making it interactive and combining the interface with the algorithms, the public can kind of like dynamically tweak these things and kind of build their own intuitions for why something, this kind of technical problem of how to analyze a congressional district, they can just maybe directly compare it to a whole space of possibilities, and that way reveal maybe strengths or weaknesses of one design. On the theme of community as well, some projects more directly focused and building off this topic of community was one was the project I got me started was Facebook Graffiti, which was a anarchist Chrome extension I released back in 2015. It put a Microsoft Paint bucket on Facebook, and every image on Facebook you could graffiti, and they were tagged by their image ID, and so it was all public, persistent, and anonymous, and you could layer on other people's images. And this coincided with the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack in France, and so this project went viral in France, and every French politician was totally graffitied, and it was kind of formed like public dialogue. So continuing with metaphor, I was interested in like the metaphor of the Facebook wall. And in 2015, you know, many of us were still on Facebook. It was starting to maybe like decay, you know, and so in the streets of a city, kind of a graffiti reflects this kind of like urban decay and indirect dialogue between everyone who walks the streets. And so Facebook graffiti this is the more political ones here, like the IRS got marked up, which I had to kind of make my own rules for what is considered, you know, too offensive or not. In that case, I considered it political, but you can obviously see there's like a kind of fine line here. And so basically every French politician and celebrity got marked up, and many of them were more kind of joyful and playful than these. People did whole murals on brands and people, but it really revealed to me the power of kind of like collective creativity. Eventually, obviously, I had to shut it down due to kind of moderation, as you can imagine. But for a brief moment, there's kind of like interesting flourishing of like public dialogue and even political outrage, you know, on the platform. Moving on, in 2024, I released Ladenscape, a collaboration with two friends, Max and Jim. And Ladenscape is named after RuneScape, is a Ladenscape.com. It's basically a thinking about the role of passive socialization and collaboration in the creative process. And so, you know, I think Artbreeder and tools like Midjourney were successful because they married kind of creating and co-education, right? If you were in Midjourney, you learned to prompt by seeing the Discord box, seeing what everyone else was doing. Artbreeder, you found these pockets of latent space by branching off other people. But there's one, you know, how can you take it even further? Could you make a kind of virtual world where the whole world was a big Ladenscape of images, and you could walk around it. You could wear, your character would pick up the clothing of what image you walk through. And so the idea here was you could kind of like find your in-group, your niche by going to that part of Ladenscape. If you're into some weird experimental aesthetic, you can just go there and hang out with people who are into that too. And by seeing people type as they're typing it, it's almost like in a pottery studio, seeing the person next to you, being like, oh, that's cool, I'm gonna try that, and kind of building off each other. Finding kind of fun exploration, you walk around the whole space, see what people are making, and kind of drop the images, and then maybe, you know, in a way like Discord, the whole feed is kind of consolidated. There's one feed for the whole community. You know, if you're into some really niche, weird aesthetic, you just walk to that part of space. You know, it's like wearing your punk clothes, going to a punk bar, you meet your other punks, and then, you know, you kind of, you find your people via the aesthetics. And so can a tool actually be that, which was Ladenscape. So the third track was one of the main ones was around craft and control, coming out of the GAN project, GAN Breeder. You know, going back to like my own clay things, I really cared about how do I make something that feels fun to make, that I can feel like is my own. You know, I got my own identity inside of it. And so a lot of the work was around craft and control, which Puppets obviously connects to. But two projects early on projects to that. One was Prose Painter in 2021, which integrated text to image, or sorry, into a traditional painting environment, just which you could kind of spatially apply these prompts, the metaphor being kind of like you're mixing inks and painting it on. The right is Collager, a tool from 2022, where you could kind of cut up these noise masks, which were used to control the diffusion process. And this is all pre-stable diffusion period. And so, yeah, with Prose Painter, people made very unique and distinct images. There was kind of a small community using it to kind of try to push the tools a little bit further, which is interesting to see how users reacted to it. Likewise with Collager, which was kind of the first image-to-image tool, where you can kind of inject your kind of noise drawings into the diffusion process. And so I basically tried to resist prompt-based interfaces since it started. Yeah, eventually users like Claire Silver, who I mentioned, took Prose Painter really far, developed very custom processes. Actually, at the height of NFTs, these Prose Painter images sold at Sotheby's. And so, yeah, over the years, I've continued to do a couple experimental interfaces, pushing the limits of craft and control. On the left is an advanced drawing tool. On the right is the collaboration with an artist, Memo, and as part of Katie, where I actually co-developed a really sophisticated painting tool for them and their project. So a lot of the Artbreeder tools, there's this kind of radical accessibility you have to kind of preserve. The making tools with the interfaces are, you can immediately pick them up. This was a fun experiment going the other direction, like don't worry about adding a million controls. See, can a stable diffusion image really, how much capacity can you unlock in the artist to make an image that feels like it's their own, but that gives them every possible area of leverage. And that was the kind of experiments in that. Unfortunately, I feel like we're losing the war on slop. As a tool maker who has worked in the generative AI space for a long time, it's been really hard for me, particularly running Artbreeder and looking at everything being made. It's hard for me to like appreciate a lot of the output, which is interesting, particularly coming from the early days of Jamreader, where I felt kind of deep personal attachment to them, and Artbreeder felt like a personal project. So then over time, kind of, what we call the slopification of the field, which is, if you want to make Mad Max Muppets like the left, there's like a referential remixes of culture. It's really great, you can get Mad Max Muppets, but will you ever make like the next Muppets, for instance? You kind of crudely imitate styles. And fill in these, your prompts, they kind of fill in whatever you don't specify with averageness. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of problems. One, I think fundamentally, I think language is a great interface for what already exists, but it's incapable of describing what hasn't yet been defined. I think more people are kind of coming on to this, but the last few years of prompt-based tools and models has, I think, been greatly limiting. And I think this problem is at the interface layer where I work, but also goes down to the model layer as well. And at CVPR this year, I tried talking to researchers and about this. And the problem goes down to the very benchmarks researchers are working on, is like image quality, adherence to the data set. This is what they're optimizing for. And I think prompting has become this kind of general interface. But in a way, a lot of other opportunities I think have been missed. And it's, as the models kind of continue, a lot of the weird areas to push the models in weird ways is also getting optimized away. So like Collager used the fact that you could inject stuff in the diffusion process. Splicer 2 used the fact that you can kind of like do weird crossover operations on these IP adapter labels, if you're familiar. But as the models kind of consolidate to just prompting, actually the kind of the areas of weird misuse are increasingly being pushed away. And I think defining the problem is I think, well, I'm going to argue now, half of it is really about language and it's overemphasis on language. I think it'll go a little further than that too. And so, I think it's funny with a lot of the, there's like things like Grok Imagine and all these marketing, every AI tool now is kind of like a wrapper around the prompt interface. And they all say, turn your ideas into reality, which sounds really nice, right? Who wouldn't want to do that? But I think this marketing slogan actually kind of reveals some of these like faulty assumptions in the creative process. this is bad. You actually don't want to do this. And I think the next part of the talk is kind of why. So for one, prompting can only express what's already been defined. I think, as I'm going to argue, novel works unfold through a creative process and are not a priori articulable. And third, actually embracing the process itself is an empowering way of nonverbal thinking. A lot of times your idea becomes itself through the process of creating it. It's really only kind of vague intuition before. And so, yeah, so here are all the, here are a couple AI tools. Each one's probably raised $1 billion. And they all kind of have the same, here's your text prompt, maybe here's some image guidance, right? This is kind of like the current paradigm today. And these are bad, I'm gonna argue, and I think not really aligned with creative use. And I think they embody what I'm calling this like X to Y paradigm or ideology, that like creativity is kind of this mapping, right? You map from your prompt to your image, or you map from your image to your video. There are these mappings that you can do. And this is kind of the ideology, let's say, of the companies, in effect, the researchers behind them. And I think this X to Y thinking is kind of the basis of SLOP. And so my toolmaking has kind of led to this new thesis here. And so I love this video of Picasso painting in this, I think, 1957 French documentary, where, they're recording his video and maybe he's being a little cheeky, but this video, which I've consolidated here, he kind of goes from a chicken to a vase to a face. While he's painting, it goes through this unfolding process of flower vase, chicken to face along the way. And while it's being cheeky, I think this actually reveals something very kind of deep about the creative process of this kind of like unfolding of the journey of the creating of itself, where to get that weird face, it had to go through the steps it goes through. And so I kind of believe that, styles are a process. And so in machine learning, there's this kind of reductive view that styles are this thing that exists and they're a point in space. So if you use Midjourney, there's like style references. A lot of tools, you upload an image as your style, right? And they apply this image encodes wholly a style, and styles exist in the space they've defined. Where I argue a style is not a point in space in a map, but it's actually an expansion of the map. And so, Pollock on the left or Cowder on the right, their styles were from their process that they created, which actually often involved them creating their own tools. Pollock created these kind of stiff paintbrushes. Cowder developed special calipers and balancing machines for his mobiles. And so each of these styles, the mobile or the Pollock painting, is actually, what is a process that they created, right? And you could follow this process too. And their innovation was the process. And so by going through the process is how you extend the map of possibilities. And so I believe that it's actually not just a useful thing as a tool maker, but almost like an ethical thing that artists need to develop their own unique styles. And so, as a tool maker, when you just create things new and unexpected, that's really fun. But if artists can't make something that really feels like their own or expression of themselves, it's not really a tool, it's more of a tech demo or a means of production. And so finding your own voice is kind of like the central part of the creative process. It's how we not only express ourselves, but discover ourselves. And if our creative tools are limiting people to these kind of manifolds or cages, you're actually kind of restricting their ability to express themselves. So yeah, so if a style is a process, in a way, artworks are the result of a process. And this has been the thesis now kind of guiding the future work I've been doing. And so I think it's kind of like malleable, expressive, open-ended process. And so I think anyone who, if anyone, probably many people here, they might work with a medium like clay or drawing, and I think it's a very obvious thing that the joy of it is the process of making it, right? And often what you create is discovered, through doodling. You kind of, you go on this journey of exploration, you create maybe opportunities to surprise yourself. You find mediums that are mostly controllable, but leave a little bit of room for kind of, rich oil paints, expressive glazes. You find opportunities to kind of surprise yourself. And again, this is kind of obvious to anyone who works in the medium. The fun, in a way, is the journey. And so tools where you try to automate the whole thing are losing that. And I think you might say, well, couldn't you do machine learning in a process? And many artists who are working meaningfully with it are doing that. But I think iterating on a prompt is fundamentally different than actually like having exploration through the unfolding of the process. Because even iterating on a prompt, you're still limiting yourself to what the kind of like the manifold of what the model is already capable of doing. It's not this kind of like emerging complexity. And again, I think it's quite obvious to anyone who enjoys working with traditional mediums. So maybe to kind of like pause on this process thing for a second and tie it back to kind of virtual life. I'm interested in these parallels between like, growth and emergence in biological settings. I want to kind of tie this together to Conway's game of life, which is kind of like simple cellular automata process where through very simple rules, complexity can unfold. And then I'm just kind of between that, and then let's go back to the process of painting. So all these are kind of these like unfolding or growth processes, right? And so Wolfram has this computational irreducibility thesis. It basically argues that certain simulations or processes cannot be reduced or have shortcuts. So this in the middle row, the cellular automata here that is like unfolding from left to right over frames. Mathematician Wolfram argues that like this is actually a process that you cannot predict the output of. You have to go through each step of the computation to get to the final result. And in a way, I think it's a really interesting metaphor for kind of like these elements of the creative process where you have to go through this growth process to get to the final output. And this process is what gives rise to emergence. It what gives rise to things out of distributions. And in a painting, this iterative process is the human in the loop, right? Interpreting, responding, unfolding, letting the process grow. So while there's no shortcuts in the growth of a plant or the unfolding of cellular automata, I feel likewise this kind of essential process is there in painting as well. Actually, the philosopher and architect Christopher Alexander, he calls this like the fundamental process. And he has this interesting thesis about some of our misunderstandings going back to essentially Descartes, which is that this idea that you can understand something by breaking it apart and putting it into its pieces. So to understand a clock, you take it apart and you look at its pieces, right? And then you could do these modular pieces and you could rearrange them and you figure out how a clock works and put it back together. And he argues this kind of view of the world is actually kind of mistaken because you don't really build a tree out of leaves, he argues, right? And similarly, you can't understand a painting by just cutting it up into its little parts and assembling it back together, which is kind of what like Stable Diffusion tries to argue, which is that like to understand this image, you just like take out a style embedding, maybe you take out a structure, and you can rebuild this image by putting it back together again, right? Which is a separate philosophy from this idea that like actually you can't understand something by its parts, you have to understand something by the process that grew it. And I think that what Alexander calls this mechanistic perspective of the world. And I think this mechanistic perspective is also at play in what we're considering SLOP today. And so a lot of the tools I've been working on the last few months are kind of derived from this, kind of like open-ended unfolding processes where the human's always in the loop. And so to kind of wrap up that part of it a little bit, I think, the last few years, people have talked about AI tools like control. We need control. That's what's kind of missing from generative AI. I think to compare that, here's like a World War I submarine, right? Lots of control, more controls than you could imagine. And I've built tools like that felt like this too, where I'm like, there's a ton of sliders, right? With all these sliders, they'll do whatever they want. And that's actually not quite right, like a tractor has control, a blender has control. That's different from like a meaningful creative tool. And likewise, talk about like, let your imaginations come to life. What I'm gonna argue here is actually we need to go like, it's not actually what you can imagine in a sense, because very few projects are fully imagined in your head before you created them, right? So within this world, like most AI tools today are kind of in this narrow circle of what's articulable, right? Like I want a cyberpunk dog on a skateboard, and like Stable Diffusion has you covered, right? And there's things beyond that you can maybe imagine. And then here's what I'm kind of coining the adjacent imaginable, which may be things that you couldn't have imagined on your own, but you can maybe build the tools or scaffold yourself into being able to imagine or create or co-create them. In a way like the floor plans, maybe something I would not have imagined that floor plan specifically on my own, or like the AlphaGo move, but we're able to kind of scaffold our own understanding of them. I think there could be more words for this. It reminds me, I think, Nietzsche says the sublime is when our imagination can't reach our concepts. I think it's really interesting. I think there's something here where it's like, what is the space of things which we can kind of allow ourselves to imagine, but we could kind of like build tools to help ourselves imagine it that we couldn't on our own. And so like there's a lot of research in like the types of patterns that we're able to kind of conceive on our own. And we actually have a lot of biases built into our own kind of mental structures. Like we really, Christopher Alexander's mentioning studies showing people patterns, seeing what they could remember, and actually like sophisticated patterns with overlapping subparts, like the brain just can't really think about. We design cities in grids, right? Because we can reason over these things. So there's whole spaces of ideas that are beyond what we can imagine. And so kind of in summary, I think what we need is actually, if I put in a sentence, expressive, open-ended mediums situated within collaborative and educational social environments. So can we use computation holistically throughout the creative process? Expressive, meaning tools that allow me to find and discover myself. Open-ended, meaning there's a journey in the process of using it that I can't really predict. I can surprise myself, build off surprises. And within these social environments where we can share our learnings, we can learn from others. A lot of the joy of creating is to get feedback and to learn, and kind of holistically support the whole creative process. So now based off some of this, what I've been working on recently, a couple different tools. One is Brushbloom, which like as of last week now in alpha, if anyone wants to play with it, at brushbloom.art. Brushbloom builds on this idea. I have two projects that build on this idea. As Pollock or Calder, their styles of building their own tools. These are both tools that allow you to kind of create your own subtools. So, this Brushbloom allows you to, it's this kind of generative brush system where all the brushes are promptable. They're supposed to be an image of breeding brushes on the right. Here's an early prototype that shows you a bunch of generative brushes that I can use. Each one is a WebGL shader I can apply in real time. Here's an old prompt box where I can prompt or mix new brushes. That's been replaced with a breeding interface. So you can actually kind of prompt the brushes that you've made and share them with other people. In this early prototype, the whole rendering engine itself was promptable. So I could prompt for some weird nodes and actually like reconfigure my own drawing tool. If I wanted to put hand tracking to color, I could just do that by actually like having as much of the tool itself be malleable. But it's kind of like scaffolding for vibe coding. And this way I could kind of like make, reconfigure the whole tool to suit my own needs. You get this kind of like expressive shader like things with these breedable brushes that are shareable. If you go to Brushbloom now, you kind of mix brushes and share them. Another tool, so I'm doing two tools this summer. The other one is Prose Painter 2. So I've been revisiting Prose Painter, kind of modern technology in a way where have kind of solved some technical issues that allow the canvas to feel very malleable. Just kind of answering this question, what if Photoshop was native for these diffusion models? You actually store all the latents, all the control nets on your local machine, and there are certain techniques that allow you to kind of like edit the latents directly, so you can keep inpainting without losing information. And here you can actually mix your own paints as well. They're kind of like pigments or like little prompts, and you can mix your brushes, and then you can save that brush and share it with other people. And here's some kind of like time lapses of painting inside of it, so you can iteratively repaint, which wasn't possible before. And that lets you kind of like grow these kind of emergent things. Here's my collaborator Jeff doing some paintings. My style is much more blobby. I really like making these like kind of sculptural blobs. This is what I've been painting in Prose Painter 2. You kind of have like weird watercolor ceramic brushes that I have fun making these kind of expressive blobs. Here's a larger one I made in Prose Painter 2. So I'm kind of like putting some base coats, looking at what it is, interpreting it, adding more things on top of it, making this weird blobby sculpture that I'm very much partial to. But it definitely kind of trying to unfold during the process, right? A little bit of surprise, building off it. I feel a little bit of form here, and creating something I couldn't otherwise. In this case, actually being able to natively paint in like 2K or 4K on the canvas. And this is in private alpha now. So yeah, the last few months have been these like two experimental painting tools focused on like user-generated subtools, these malleable iterative processes, right? Nodes with input-output mappings, they're kind of continuously reworking this malleable open-ended medium where I could find ways to kind of surprise myself and create my own subtools. I think maybe to kind of like wrap up now, talk about like some of the other final stuff I'm doing. So I've done a lot of stuff in the code synthesis space. One project from last year was called Illuminate, which is applying some of these genetic algorithms to LLM-based generation. The language models are very bad at creating creative outputs, right? They kind of are very homogeneous in their outputs. And so Illuminate tries to kind of systematically resolve this by applying diverse reasoning strategies and kind of evolutionary pressure to explore the space of possibilities. So the top there, if you asked it for a cool shader, you would get those kind of spiral patterns. So language model is very biased toward like kind of saturated spirals. By running Illuminate, you get this like vast space of possible things that it could create through this creative pressure. And so I also developed a technique of using creative reasoning strategies. If you're familiar with Brian Eno's oblique strategies, actually like systematically applying these different creative reasoning strategies to the language model to help it kind of further its space of what it could create. And it turns out giving the language models things like oblique strategies actually help it in its sampling of things. And began the process of like finding, this is with reasoning models specifically. And so it turns out a lot of the work is finding these parallels where like the models are inspired by processes in the world, and they go back and help you kind of loop. In this case, like oblique strategies also help the language models. And this could just be, I think, the beginning of like thinking through what does creative thinking mean for the models, how to help it with its sampling. And so continuing to kind of explore like how do you kind of co-create with these larger systems. Also, yeah, so you kind of see this and measure the structured coverage of the space. So if you're familiar, like this kind of shows you kind of the diversity of the outputs over time. So as you run this algorithm, kind of it continues to kind of explore and cover the space in a way that like may help mediate a lot of the issues of working directly with language models, which do have a kind of homogenization effect of people creating similar things. And so I think this is one component to that, is just saying, well, how diverse can the models get? What do they need to help them in their creative process? And so, we can also apply it to like programming clocks. So the top row is like, if you ask the language model to like generate a cool clock in P5.js, they all look basically identical with like slight variation of color. But actually, if you evolve this like diverse population of clocks, it has the capacity through, kind of applying genetic algorithms with the language model and these creative reasoning strategies, you're able to cover a huge space of possibilities. And so this kind of brings me to what I'm, in addition to the painting tools, working on currently. So, imagine basically yoking and directing this like ample, brittle intelligence towards creative exploration, essentially mechanizing the exploratory aspects. And so I think this begins to distill the user input to having good taste and questions and intuitions to what directions are worth exploring. In this sense, like these programs are no longer tools, but almost kind of like what I'm considering like creative escalations. So the PhD student becomes the PI becomes the lab head, the lab head becomes the director of the university, whatever. Like you're working with kind of like ample intelligence. You can kind of direct and guide and work at a different layer of abstraction. And so what I'm working on now, so you can imagine, instead of coding the floor plan system, I could unleash this herd of AI agents exploring diverse representations of floor plans. I could be the director of an AI floor plan research university, and they're all growing and optimizing floor plans. I'm providing high level input to it. So that's some of the work I'm working on now. And I think this will actually be basically the next 5 years of, I think, creative tools research and to explorations into the extended imagination. So with that, yeah, thank you very much.
so if anybody has questions online, you're welcome to put it in chat. And if anyone in person has questions, feel free to raise your hand and I can bring my laptop over so people can online can hear you.
Wait.
Great talk, by the way. Sorry. I wonder about that last point you made about swarms. So you showed this that the process matters and this hypothesis and that you need to be there in every step of the process. But then with this multi-agent swarm things, it's actually, okay, let's create a lot of things that are actually impossible to track through, like there are exponentially many processes happening. What do you think about that two things?
Do you want to unmute, actually?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think it's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. It's something I've been thinking about too. I think in a way, there's that the answer of the process, the question of the process, I think hasn't fully been answered. It's just a question in this kind of agent-based system. I think the metaphor, the interface is different. I think the ways of, I think you could be involved in the process in different ways, in the way like your advisor is part of your process, is finding the right, they're not just getting the final outputs at the end. I think it won't be the exact metaphor of like this malleable medium you're shaping directly with your hands, having real-time control, but it'll be about, and that's some of the work, I guess, that's what I'm working on now, essentially, is figuring out like what are the meaningful touch points of human intervention through that process of the swarm. So I think Luminate was kind of like the first step of it, in a way, of just seeing like what are the capabilities of the model. And what I'm actually working on right now, which I'm glad you asked that, is that question of where does the human need to come in? What is the level of control you want to balance surprise? It may be partially language-based, example-based, finding ways to kind of shape the space. I thought of like gardening as metaphor, you're kind of like fertilizing certain parts of the space and you're culling others and kind of using that as a way to kind of, rather than breeding one object, you're kind of like tending to a larger garden of objects. But I think it's something I'm still working through, yeah.
I really, really enjoyed your talk, and it was bringing to mind an article that published in The Atlantic yesterday that I'm just finished reading about problems with so many tools that are created these days because they aim to make things frictionless.
Frictionless?
Frictionless.
Yes.
And the importance of friction in human systems, either for individual work or democracy and so on. And I don't know, those ideas seem to relate very much to what you're saying. When systems evolve, be it, dogs or processes in art, when you go through multiple steps and there's a little friction along the way, that helps guide you toward making things better. And, it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think friction is a great way to think about it. If it's serendipity or things that push back, something where your learnings are, where working with wood or with clay, friction comes when your models don't map to its representations, and the opportunity for you to adjust or to learn. So if it's pushback or friction, I think that's, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
So I love these examples of artists historically who have built their own tools, and kind of you being both a tool builder and an artist. I can imagine how you make a thing and then you use the thing to make something.
Yeah.
And that's super cool. And I'm kind of wondering about this tension of someone else using your tool, and to what extent can they represent their own visions and intention in your tool versus kind of the obligation for people to make their own tools in order to express their own ideas. So do you see a tension in this kind of dual hats of being a tool maker and an artist? Do you think, as you saw people kind of used these tools you've made and then kind of graduated, do you think that's like the graduation is the key step? Or do you envision these as kind of general purpose tools that creators who maybe aren't as technically literate as you are
can actually make artistic artifacts that are feeling truly theirs?
Yeah, it's another great question. I think there's can definitely be some tension. I remember the first time people posted Artbreeder images like without citing me, and I was like, "What the hell, man? Like, you can't just do that." Or like, well, the first time someone made a lot of money off like an Artbreeder NFT, and like I was kind of like, "Hey," but at the same time, I stopped myself and be like, "Wait a second, actually, that's good." Like, Photoshop, they're not taking out, claiming outputs. So like that's what I'm striving toward. I think that's like sometimes more of an aspiration than a reality, and it depends a lot on the tool. Like Artbreeder, the way it's a spectrum, like Artbreeder is more like it felt kind of like collective search together, and I felt like it's kind of like creative superorganism we're all part of. I would say people who took those images and like sometimes it feels clear, like people would take an image and it would go through this like 10-step print make on it, they'd paint over that and cut that up, and there was like, okay, well, that's like totally yours. I'm glad I was like one piece of it. Um, so I think you want to be able to like feel the artist coming through. And you want to feel more of the artist in the tool, I would say. Otherwise, it's less of a tool, maybe more of like fun, I don't know, toy. Which is nothing wrong with the toy, and like so I think there's room for things at different steps of like the learning curve essentially. Where I do think about it as like smoothing out this learning curve and having tools at different steps of the process where like jumping right to oil painting can be very harsh, particularly like with a lot of standards on what a good oil painting looks like, and not everyone feels comfortable jumping in. So I think it's okay to have tools that are like on the other end of the spectrum, or maybe like you have a certain ceiling what you can do, but a very low floor. And then there can be things at different steps of the process. It might be hard to have a one tool that covers the whole spectrum. So I do think there's room for different things, but there definitely can be tension.
Also, thanks. Like I'm still thinking a lot about the talk, so but I like the one question I had also towards the direction of controllability. How do you think about your intuition when building these things, and how is it connected to the model? Do you have the feeling over time that you build an intuition for the tool, or do you build more of an intuition for the model to control the model to build the output? And does your intuition change the model, and how do you control that? This question makes sense, like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Another great question. Thank you. I think in a way, I guess it's a little bi-directional. Sometimes I'm like, I wish there was here's a mechanic I wish existed. Is there a model for it? Sometimes like, here's a model, what can be done? Where I think like originally some of the like GAN breeder was like inspired by pick breeder, and then seeing the GAN and seeing kind of the connection there. I think with the fusion model, things like Collager came from like just trying to hack on the model, seeing what are the levers of control, building some. I think the intuition has evolved over the years too, where like I think Collager was like, what is too complicated or too simple? I feel like I've been dialing in a lot over the years, or what's too slow. So I think it's definitely bi-directional. I am not. I think there's some teams where they've designed it, they're actually building architectures from the ground up in a way, because I don't do that. I'm a bit limited to like, which is a little unfortunate, and part of why I think it's been frustrating to work in is because the models are getting limited. So, and they're prompt based, so there's less room to kind of find weird ways to work with them. But it's definitely about actually like, just playing with models, seeing what the weird areas to hack on are, and also having some theories on what would be fun and waiting for models to come out that might fit it.
We have one question online, and it is 3 or 5, so maybe the last one.
Okay.
By Alex. Would you define creativity, or we have another one too. Hold on. Would you define creativity as randomness followed by a discrete decision, similar to mutation followed by selection? In that case, is the constraint on creativity humans' ability to sample a sufficiently broad set of random directions? Is that a potential approach one can use to codify creativity?
Is it random sampling followed by? Oh, I was looking at that. Oh yeah. Oh, right here. Oh, I got it. Thank you. Hmm. Codifying creativity is a slippery thing that I might not attempt not to do. I've definitely heard of like, sampling a lot and filtering being two aspects to it. I mean, there's different lenses to creativity. I mean, like there's systems approaches to creativity that look at it at the network level of people and like, human nodes in a graph. I mean, you could think about it as formalizing it as like at the city level, like why is East Village or Florence more creative? And you can think about it as like this confluence of like trade and education and commerce. And we're just nodes in this graph. And maybe that's like, so I don't know if it's input randomness or like, there's definitely things that help. I mean, as a node in the graph, like diverse inspiration, is, there's so many things that being discerning, having diverse inspiration, openness to unusual connections. Yeah, I'm hesitant to make too many claims to creativity, but definitely though, I mean, I think interpreting randomness is important. Filtering is important. I would be hesitant to make that kind of all of creativity is though. Be my answer. But that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have to run, but I'm happy to go through it. For sure. So, what do you think of the embodiment of I need to parse this. Good question. You're working embedded in creativity, and if so, it's a process. Done. Ground control. I need to think about this a little bit, I think. A lot of that's a hard question, so I need a moment. But about embodiment, I don't know if I follow. Surface it doesn't attribute code for around control. Oh, I'm not sure the answer to that exactly. LMs no longer need human input. So the point where the LMs no longer need human input. It's hard to make predictions about the future of LLMs. Probably people in this room are better than that than I am. At least with the reasoning models, they seem, at least the way they're trained, is all around a lot of mathematics and convergent things. So I don't think people really begin to think around what do LLMs for divergence mean. Obviously, they are trained on human data. So I think it's like intuition or like what are worthwhile questions, I think for my interest is we'll definitely need human input. I mean, I don't know what it means otherwise. In a way, like maybe a point to end on in terms of like these systems and their automation is that and codifying things. In a way, a lot of creativity is knowing what rules to break. And the system's always been trained on things that come from rules. And so I don't know if there's any way to codify like being good at knowing what rules to break in a way that's like kind of what the systems are, or like these kind of like codification of rules. In a way, like a lot of the good creative or scientific process is knowing like what assumptions to challenge, what things to kind of like what anarchistic perspectives to take that rebel against existing things. So I can't imagine LMs doing that, but I am also been bad at predicting the future LMs. But I think that's an interesting way to think about how we could collaborate with them best. So maybe that's a good point to rest on.
I think that will be closing here. Thank you everyone for coming, both in person and online. And of course, thank you to both Joel and Zivi for coming and helping with this talk. We'll be ending the recording and see you all another time.
Great. Thank you. Moving on.